So please feel free to ask your questions during the discussion, and don't wait until the end. We really want you to be part of what we are doing today. So I mentioned Ofir. Hi, Ofir. So happy to have you. Ofir is the CEO of Taranis. Maybe you can introduce yourself in 2 sentences before we dive in.
Sure, that would be great. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I started Taranis about close to 6 years ago. After a long career in the Israeli intelligence and a longer background in agriculture from my family who farm in Ginusar and Alal back in Israel. So it's kind of been a merge of my 2 passions, and we're excited to see the company grow, and we're about 80 people right now. About half are in Israel, half are abroad, mostly in the US. And we're active mostly in the Midwest here in the US.
Perfect. And you will tell us all about the recent fundraising round that you closed. It's very exciting. But before we talk about this, I want also to welcome Shirish to this conversation. Shirish has many years of experience as an investor. Hi, Shirish. So happy to have you. Would you share with our attendees a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've been in the venture business for about 19 years and across a whole range of industries, all high tech, of course, and across different markets. I have been a partner at funds starting from $1 billion down to 100 million. And I'm interested in Agtech. I made a few investments, and of those, some have been successful, very successful, and some have been not so much. So I'm quite interested in learning more from this group here and having a discussion.
Perfect. And also to mention, you also invested in Israeli technologies, but we will hear about it in a minute. Last but not least, we have Adam Bergman with us. Adam used to lead the investment in Arctech in Wells Fargo, and now he is a partner with Ecotech Capital. Adam, so happy to have you this morning.
Great. Well, I appreciate being here. And my background is I've been an investment banker for over 20 years, working with growth companies. And I've worked the gamut from healthcare, internet, through tech, and spent the last 15 years on clean tech, everything from renewable energy to utility technologies to mobility and transportation. But I spent the last almost 6 years now with most of my time focused on agriculture and food technology, and have done a lot of work with early and growth stage companies as well as Israel. So for me, it's a great opportunity to be here to talk to people. We have a fantastic panel, which will give a lot of real good insight on what's happening.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Before we start the discussion, since we have more people joining in, I really want to remind you that this is an open Q&A, which is very different than most of the webinars that we all participate. So we want you, if possible, to share your screen so we can also see you. So the way it's going to work, if you have a question, please unmute yourself and introduce yourself by the name and the company, if possible, also your position in the company, and then ask your question. If you can direct it specifically to one of the people that participate here, that will be great. But please, again, just share with us your insights and your questions, and I think it's going to be a very interesting 60 minutes and hopefully also insightful. So I think the best is to start with you, Adam, to really understand when we talk about Agtech, and we talk to a lot of people, and also some of the names that I see here on my screen. There are so many different things that go under Agtech. Can you just help us to understand what do we include in Agtech?
Sure. So I'm gonna share my screen to give you a perspective of kind of how I look at the world. So
perfect.
For me, this is kind of the world I live in, and I say ag tech and I put food tech with it. But for me, it's really these 8 areas, starting really from the farm and working our way right to the fork. So starting with ag biotech. So ag biotech to me is anything that's happening in the soil, whether it's crop nutrients, whether it's seeds, and going all the way through to soil health and then CRISPR. Animal ag tech is what we're seeing with innovations to help animals either improve yield for the animal farms, or to make life more humane for the animals, or even interesting technology like we've seen recently with the announcement from Burger King that they were feeding a new diet of seaweed and other crops to the cows to decrease methane consumption, which was pretty interesting. Automation and robotics, everything we're seeing on the farm. Digital ag, which is a huge one. I know Ofir will talk a bit about that. Digital ag being everything from drones and satellites in the sky to sensors on the ground. And then what I would argue is the toughest part, which I know Ofir is working through, is how do you take all that data and actually put it into something that can be used by a farmer or by even a bank or insurance company to make some decisions. Waste mitigation is another area. 30% of our food typically gets wasted, and it's a huge issue, not just because of that food waste and the environmental impact, but the numbers I've seen show about 18% of cropland is used unnecessarily, about 20% of crop nutrients. So it's a big issue there, and they say about 20% of what goes into the dumps today is actually food waste. Supply chain technologies is a big issue that a lot of people are talking through, and particularly with safety and traceability, and then everyone's favorite word, blockchain, which pre-COVID you couldn't actually do a webinar without mentioning. It seems to have fallen back a bit. And then more into the food side. So alternative protein is all the rage at the moment. So everything that's going in from plant protein to cellular meat, and then into bug-based protein. And then finally, indoor farming. And again, another area that's gained a lot of momentum recently. So for me, it's a very broad approach of what is being covered. And I would argue what's interesting is it hits so many different areas of traditional economy. So we think about it's ag, but ag biotech, it could come out of the technology from healthcare, and automation or robotics could come out of the industrial sector. And you're seeing other areas around health and nutrition coming in. So food and ag is really broadening and taking technology from other industries and adapting it for the food and ag sector.
Perfect. So we have those 8 sectors within Agtech, and we are focusing for our purposes with the Israeli innovation. From your experience, and I know you have a lot of knowledge about Israeli entrepreneurs and companies and startups and so on, where would you say are the strengths of the Israeli startups?
So I think without a doubt, and I'm not just playing to the crowd because Ofir's here, it's digital ag. What you're seeing out of Israel, most of the companies I'm seeing still have a digital ag. And again, I think what's really important is I was moderated a webinar recently with Wells Fargo's chief ag economist. And I think he had a really good point, which is technology is not typically developed for the ag sector. Technology is developed in other industries, and then the ag sector adopts it. It's if you think about AI, machine learning, all of these technologies, none of them were invented for the ag sector. They were invented in other sectors, and they are now being used effectively in the ag sector. And a lot of the reason is the ag sector is very conservative, and because it's conservative, they're not going to be a first user of technology. So they want to know that a technology works. So it's going to be validated typically in another industry, and then will be brought into ag. So digital ag is clearly one that's at the forefront without a doubt. Another one is automation and robotics. There's clearly a lot of strong innovation. I'm seeing a number of Israeli companies that are innovating. And one of the things I would say about that is, if you think about Israel as a country, it's a small country. It doesn't have a lot of excess labor. So similar to some of the issues that the US faces, having the ability to do automation and robotics is really important. I've also seen a significant growth recently around alternative protein, so on the food tech side. And we know Israel has become a food mecca, so I don't think it's surprising that there would be that type of innovation. But what I find interesting is Israel's doing some really interesting things. I was impressed. There was a company I came across who's 3D printing steaks. And what I found interesting is they're taking both the Israel's capability and knowledge around food tech, but also using another area where I would argue they have some competitive advantage, which would be around 3D printing. So I think when you take that all together, I look at digital ag, automation, robotics, alternative protein. I know historically there have been some interesting work around ag biotech or ag genetics. And then the area I don't have up here, because it's still kind of smaller, but I would always argue Israel is probably the world leader, which is at advanced irrigation. And Israel has just tremendous capabilities around the irrigation side because of the necessity of what its farming capabilities are and its lack of water. So those are the areas that I would signal as really leadership. And I always like to say, Israel's leadership should be predicated on where it has a defined competitive advantage around technology. So I don't think it should be looking to get into places where the technology would just be used for that product. But again, I expect they're taking technology from the military or other high-tech industries and adapting it into food and ag.
I see. So, with that, I actually want to ask Shirish, looking at all those different opportunities within the Agtech, what we see on the screen with this beautiful slide that Adam prepared for us, what drew you into, investing in this sector? Why do you think there is a big potential in that in general?
Sure. So first of all, Adam, this is classification is very good. I've never actually consciously made that classification in my head, so this is actually very helpful. I think, well, to us investors, making money for our investors is basically our primary function, and so we follow emerging markets, new markets where there's a market opportunity that is small, maybe small right now, but then is getting bigger. So if I look at the US as a agricultural nation, I think the fundamentals on the ground are changing. Climate is changing. The country is getting drier in some places, wetter in some other places, hotter in some places, and colder in other places. And a technology that can address those issues is critically important. Second, the application of technology to agriculture is an opportunity that is just sitting there waiting to be taken advantage of. And yes, there have been some steps in that direction. In fact, I made an investment in a company that did that, and we can talk about that. But I think if you look at what Israel is good at, they're great at technology. And because of the conditions on the ground, the way the soil is, the way the climate is, the arid climate, they're very good at addressing the needs of the broader US economy because of the way things are changing. That's why I'm quite interested in this. And I've had good luck with Agtech companies, and I have good luck with Israeli entrepreneurs, but I have yet to find an Israeli entrepreneur doing an Agtech company. That's why I'm here.
Okay, great. So with this last sentence that you mentioned, when you look at a startup, when I'm sure you get pitched, all the time and get lead, and a lot of people contact you and other investors also. And I know you invest also in other sectors, not just in Agtech. So when you go to evaluate a startup in this area in Agtech, what are you looking for in a startup?
I don't think what we look for in an Agtech startup is any different from what we look at in general. And what we're looking at is whether this new idea is attacking a market that is receptive to a startup, right? And whether this is a need that is an extreme need for the end customer, right? And we can talk about, I can give you some examples. And or is it, or in the venture capitalist shorthand, is it a vitamin or is it an aspirin? We like to invest in aspirins, right? Because if you have a headache, you're going to buy the aspirin, right? So that's one thing we look at. Second, and this is where I think it becomes very interesting. I think if we focus on the founders and the founding team, I always think of a founder, not whether he or she has lots of experience or comes from the space. All those things are not important. What's important is whether they have the inherent characteristics of a founder. And here are the characteristics. They have to be highly aggressive because the world is against them, right? They have to be open-minded thinkers of something completely off the off the wall. If you look at most great companies, they're not founded by people who are from the space, right? There are many examples, right? Uber was not founded by an executive from Hertz, right? Tesla was not founded by an executive from General Motors. I mean, you can think of these examples. So that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody who just won't take no for an answer, who will be highly innovative and be highly flexible, who will be open to changing their tactics on a daily basis, but still stay true to their strategy. There's a big difference. People who don't want to change their tactics are inflexible in the face of new data. If they still keep doing what they're doing, then the company doesn't do well at all. So these are the things we look at. And if you look at the market and the founders, the technology takes care of itself. And I've said this before, that if you find a great founding team in a great market, you build a unicorn. If you find a great founding team in a bad market, you get your money back, right? And if you find a great market, but not such a great founding team, you might get your money back or maybe a little bit better. But I think I think focusing on both the founder and the market is critically important across the investing spectrum. In AgTech, you want to see whether the company that these founders are starting is something that they have a unique understanding of the market. Not necessarily that they're from that market, but they have an understanding of the market and the technology solves a real problem that the customer has.
I see. So talking about founders and entrepreneurs and startups, we have Ofir here, and I see also that we have some other founders looking at the different names here. Ofir, we heard about what Adam said about the Israel innovation and the mindset, and we had Shirish also talking about what they're looking for when they're looking at startups and the founders and the management team. And also Adam mentioned the technologies that are coming from military and other uses into not just military, but into AgTech. Can you share with those who do not know Taranis, first of all, what the company is doing? And you mentioned also earlier that your personal background and the fact that you grew up in an agriculture environment was pretty natural for you to get into this, industry. Can you share with us a little bit about this?
Yeah, of course. So as Adam mentioned, we're in this broad digital ag area that has a lot of different facets. We're specifically looking at the previous revolutions in agriculture industry, and I think the biotech was one of the biggest ones. Automation was another one, and there's others. And I think there's more ways to get a lot of value from those industries, those innovation, together with the digital ag. So we really feel that we are intertwined with the ag, biotech, and the automation as two very close areas, and especially the robotics, because drone is also kind of robot. So what Taranis does is we basically help retailers and co-ops that work with growers. We help them increase their volume of serving more acres with the same headcount. We help them retain their customers. We help them upsell their core products. We even enable them to create a new tier of service for their growers. To do that, we're using a fleet of drones and planes with some proprietary electro-optic system and analyzing all the results with AI. But really we're talking, and this is a switch we had to do it sort of recently, just in the last 2 years, we kind of understood we talk to the benefits to the grower and to the retailers and the ecosystem, and not really talk about what is the technology. That sometimes not the most important thing. We initially, our entire pitch, our entire deck was all about the electro-optics and the AI and what it is, what's unique. It's not necessarily the most important thing. It's how we do it, but really we first had to understand how are we part of this ecosystem of agtech and mostly the general agriculture ecosystem. But having said that, it's very unique on the technology side too, and it is partly my background in computer vision and some of the other founders' experience in electro-optics in aerospace companies in Israel, like Elbit. And we brought that together, brought the agronomy and the electro-optics and AI together to create Taranis. And we are seeing the market respond to this because they're experiencing basically a lot of yield potential losses during every season. It's estimated around 35% of yield is lost due to weeds become more resistant, diseases that also evolve and become harder to control with chemicals, and nutritional deficiencies that are hard to come by and find, as well as just even beginning of the season, the planting quality. There's a lot of replant with the volatile weather and climate that we're seeing. It's getting to be a bigger and bigger problem. This season was better than last. Last season, there was almost 20% of non-planted acres. This season, there was about close to 5% of replant in some places. And we helped many millions of acres understand their planting quality, a week after they did their planting process. And then started serving them every week of the seasons, showing them what fields perform not as good as they wanted to and what they can do to solve it and be actionable.
I see. Great. So, one of the questions that we are being asked by investors, is they're looking at, especially those that do not have experience with Israeli startups. They're asking us, okay, so do they plan to venture into the US market? It seems that it's the other side of the world, it's different culture, it's different language, it's maybe a different market. And again, I'm talking about those who do not have experience. And then on the other hand, we speak with Israeli startups, and it seems that everybody's trying to get out of Israel for different reasons. Can you share with us, why did you choose to venture into the US market, since our discussion is about raising funds here?
Yeah, of course. I think for us and many of the Israeli founders, we understand that the local market is not very relevant, besides a place to do a proof of concept and experimentation.
Is it not relevant, or is it just too small?
For us, it was both, because the smaller the farm is, the more the farmer really knows it. And in the US, we see a totally different ecosystem. We see growers who are leasing lands, and they don't know the lands that they just got added this season, last season. Mm-hmm. It takes years to really know those areas, and we help compensate for that. The larger the farm is, the harder to scout it. So for us, it was the whole size of the total market, but also the crops and how they farm. But nonetheless, it was great to have great access to agronomy talent that also consult outside of Israel. So that served us in the very early days, and still today, a lot. And that's how we come back, really met our first customers, whether it's in the US or Brazil. It was through these agronomists in Israel that also kind of brought their knowledge outside of Israel. But I think, at some point in a company's lifespan, they have to be closer to the market. And US, I think, for agriculture is very, very relevant. One of the largest, most tech-oriented. And also, like you're saying, for the funding perspective, I think at some point it's more relevant to the US based funds. I'm happy to see that more funds, generalist funds, are doing ag tech deals, and more ag oriented deals are more ag funds are being formed. So I think the opportunities now are better than when we started by far. And I think companies need to consider doing, at least putting everything customer facing and market facing in their market as soon as possible. I mean, we did that. I just moved about a year ago. It's actually going to be a year in this end of September. And it's been very, very positive change for the entire company. Before that, we also had teams locally here that was hugely important. But I really encourage founders to consider that if their market is really here, that's where they need to be. And the funding will come with that, as they're successful and understand the market, that will come.
Yeah, thank you. So Ofir just mentioned that he eventually moved to the US, and that your market you mentioned earlier, it's in the Midwest, right? I have a question for Adam, and by the way, I get questions on the private Q&A, but really this is an open discussion. So we hold it as a meeting and not as a webinar. So you can just ask directly the speakers or anybody else that you see on the screen. But I want to address this question to Adam. Why California? We are the California Israel Chamber of Commerce. Our focus is naturally on California. But what is in California, and we see it also in other sectors, not just in Agtech, that we would recommend startups or entrepreneurs to at least have a base in California or go through California when they enter the US market? What's so centralized here? And you're on mute, by the way.
Sure, thanks. So one of the most important things is that California is the center of ag. I like to tell people, starting out doing as I did in the clean tech world, where I was doing energy, whether it was solar, wind, or biofuels, energy's never been a leading play for the Bay Area or California, really. There's definitely energy here, but it's not a major business. Ag is huge, and I tell people sitting in the Bay Area, to the north of me, I've got Davis and UC Davis and everything that's there, as well as a lot of ag land. To the south of me, I've got a lot going on as well that's happening down in the Central Valley and other areas. So from my perspective, there's a tremendous amount that's happening today in California from an ag perspective. A lot of people don't know this, and I think it's still the case, but California is the largest dairy producer still today. And it's really where most of the specialty crops come. If you think about your lettuce and you think about the berries, that this is California. Now, clearly California is not the leader in traditional row crops. You're not going to see a lot of corn and soy and cotton here. But the higher value and higher margin crops are really in California. And why I think a lot of entrepreneurs like to come here for two reasons. One, because we are at the center of innovation in California, particularly the Bay Area, so you're around other entrepreneurs. And two, California has a lot of problems that it's going to take real technology innovation to overcome. Let's think about what we have here. It's a high-cost area. Labor costs have skyrocketed with a $15 minimum wage. We've got tremendous amounts of regulation. These are all problems that technology is going to have to overcome, because if technology can't overcome it, these farms are going to go out of business. So I've found more and more over the last few years that many growers that I used to go and speak to, who 5 years ago would say, we like robotics and automation, and we think it's going to be important in the future. Every year I'd speak to them when they thought the need of using robotics and automation gets much quicker every year, to the point where if you look today, whether it's just the cost structure or COVID-19, you talk to growers all the time and everyone wants autonomous weeding. They want autonomous harvesting, because they realize that what we're facing today are some really significant challenges. And again, a difference between, say, specialty crops and row crops, you can't let your lettuce or your berries stay on unpicked for more than an extra day or so, or they're going to spoil or go bad, where you have a little bit more flexibility with your corn and your wheat. And even when you harvest it, you could put it in a silo and it's going to last. I think we all know what happens from the fruits and vegetables we eat, even sitting in our refrigerator, if they last a couple days. It doesn't look very good. So I think the favorite saying is necessity is the mother of invention. And I would argue, with the challenges that California has on one hand and the great soil and fertility that it has, it's a great place to be. And the one thing I didn't mention, which is again a huge, I think, strength for Israeli companies, is California is going through a tremendous water crisis. And we all know that no one is more effective at using and reusing water than Israel is.
Yeah. Adam, there is a question from Sudhir. I see also wants to ask a question. So Sudhir, why don't you go first?
Yes. Hi, Adam. This is Sudhir Joshi from UC Berkeley. I have a question regarding vertical farms. My interest in vertical farms is because they use so little water and the labor can be more efficient because it's centralized. Can you comment on the economic viability of vertical farms in California?
So I'll start. You asked me a good question, because I'll start with a story. And I apologize, Sharon. I like to tell stories. I'll do it quick. So I went to see Plenty 5 years ago, incredibly skeptical. I walked in, sat down with the CEO, and said the following: I understand why vertical farms make sense in the East Coast, in the Midwest, and the Southeast, because almost all of the lettuce and berries are grown out in California, Arizona, or Mexico, and are shipped cross country. And now you're dealing with both a climate change because of emissions of transportation and a loss because they have to travel so far. Explain to me why you are building an indoor farm 60 miles from where all the lettuce in America is grown. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so he said, come with me. So we walked into the farm and he showed me around, and he actually gave me the food, and it was the best tasting food I had. And I said to him, explain to me what technology you're using. And he said, it's not technology. We are growing food for taste, not for logistics. And then he said to me, do you know why iceberg lettuce exists? And I said, not really, because it's pretty much a green wrapper around water. And he said, because they realized 100 years ago, they could take iceberg lettuce, pack it in big blocks of ice, and it would survive to get to New York City. And he said, since that point, the traditional focus has been on how do you move ag products rather than how do you get better tasting products. So to answer your question, one, greenhouses today are economic. There's a number of them, particularly Gotham Greens is one, Little Leaf Farms is another one, who I've seen their financials, and they actually are making money. So I can tell you that the greenhouse side today, I have no doubt, makes money. The question is really on what we'd say the vertical farms. Very different, for those who don't know, the difference being a greenhouse uses at least some sunlight. They could use mostly sunlight or half sunlight, but a vertical farm only uses LED lights. I tell people I'm really excited about a vertical farm for one key reason. We've been growing under the sun for thousands of years. And I'm not going to say we've 100% optimized it, because there will be some advantages with CRISPR still, but we've pretty much optimized it. We've never grown under LED lights. And if you think about technology innovation in CRISPR, I don't know what we can do, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity to really make vertical farming, whether it's yield, whether it's taste, to optimize it through CRISPR. So to your question, I don't see any reason why vertical farming in California is not going to work. It was very interesting to see the deal Plenty signed recently with Albertsons. I don't know if they're making money yet. I haven't seen their numbers recently. But I would say the following. I also think that you're going to find consumers potentially willing to pay a premium? I always tell people, and it's an interesting thing to hear from the crowd here. Most people are surprised when they hear organics have chemicals and pesticides, because a lot of people assume organics aren't made with chemicals and pesticides, and they are. They're just different ones that the government has deemed better, so they're organic. And I like to say, will a consumer pay more for a product grown indoor, which is going to be more farm to table? Potentially, if they're smart, these vertical farms are going to use solar power, so it can be 100% renewable power. It's going to be closer to the customer, so there'll be less emissions from transportation, and they can use water more effectively, and they're not using chemicals and pesticide. So what will you pay for a post-organic lettuce? Will you pay a premium? And by the way, it should taste better, because now, again, you're not worried about logistics. So I think there's an opportunity here. I always used to say in other areas of clean tech, I did not think people were going to pay a meaningful premium for solar, because they don't see solar, they don't taste solar. I think people will pay a premium for indoor grown products if it has a better taste, it's more sustainable, and it's grown without chemicals.
I think Catherine Jacob has a question that relates to your last sentence, and I'm sorry, Oz. Catherine, do you want to ask your question?
I was going to say, Catherine, we don't hear you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yep, yes. We hear you.
Sorry. So what about the energy consumption? It never appears on any of those vertical farming company websites, but I think that's a big issue.
It is a tremendous issue. My response to you will be, as I mentioned, one component will be, are they using solar on the site, which could definitely defray it. And the other comment's going to be, where is it from? If an indoor farm in California is going to look very different than an indoor farm in Ohio, because California gets a tremendous amount of its electricity from solar and coming from north of us through hydro. So there's a lot less fossil fuels. So the definitely energy is twofold. One, it's a sustainability question. The other is an actual cost structure, because when you're growing outdoors, you're not paying for the sun, but when you're growing indoors, you're paying for the lighting. So there's definitely two components, I would say, that are really important when you're looking at indoor farming and the energy component to it. I seem to look at energy as going to be a cost, and it's going to be likely renewable, most of the clients I'm talking to. But you have to overcome that cost by, in my mind, automation, robotics, and really strong efficiency to make these vertical farms work much better, because you are adding a cost in indoor farming with energy that you don't have in outdoor farming.
Okay, Oz, you had a question. Is that related to the same topic?
Yes, it's related to indoor, which is vertical as well, and to Israel and to California, and it has to do with medical cannabis. I won't mention the other type, okay?
Okay.
So I'm a bit surprised, Adam, that you did not mention, because Israel is gigantic in medical cannabis. Holland is gigantic in tomatoes, et cetera, all around the world. And in California, it's a $3 billion a year industry growing at 20%. And it's a fascinating one in terms of data, in terms of monitoring. Just to give people a tiny bit of a sense, it's easily more than $1,000 a square meter to start an indoor medical cannabis facility, okay? The revenues are approximately $2,500 a square meter as well. So the costs of the inputs are extremely high anywhere in the world, but you get it back in productivity if you're smart, okay? So that's a field that's interesting to me. I'd like to hear any thoughts and so forth.
So I would say the following. Having spent my whole life up until a few months ago at large banks, it's not even a conversation, because we could never touch them. So it's not an area I've spent a lot of time. That being said, I've had a number of conversations with the team at Canopy, who's up in Canada and one of the biggest players. My comment on cannabis at least in the US, is as follows. It's a niche market from a investor and other perspectives in most regards until the federal government decides that it's not a crime or a criminal product. It's very, we all see what's happening in California, but I think I'll let Shirish provide his thoughts, but I can tell you from a finance and banking perspective, until the federal government says you can have a business in California and you can have a business in Colorado and you can take that money and actually move it between the states, it's really difficult for people like me to focus on it, because it's really going to be difficult to scale and operate in a one state business. I agree with you. It has incredible opportunities. And I think I haven't seen the data, but I would assume during COVID-19, cannabis use has skyrocketed, whether it's medical or non-medical. I would assume it's way
Not
up.
me, so I hear.
Now, I can tell you that there is at least one person on this conversation here that has a lot of experience in that. We held a big conference about medical cannabis. We saw a lot of hope in that area. We had some Israeli companies that presented. We had over 70 investors in the room. It seems that since that day, there is more of a hype than a hope in that area, but we can leave it to a different conversation, because I think the majority of the people on this call are not in that particular area. We looked at that from the perspective of the CICC as another crop, so we put it under our Agtech activity. But as Adam just mentioned, it's still problematic, although it's legal here in California. The trade between the states, the banking systems and so on. I'm happy to discuss that particular crop separately. We have some more questions coming regarding investments. I think Jonathan wanted to ask Shirish a question. Go ahead, Jonathan. You're on mute.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Sierra from Yarok Microbio. I'm speaking from Jerusalem, from the biohouse of the Hadassah University Hospital right now. I have a question. We have developed a new technology for extremely fast detection of bacteria like E. coli, Listeria, Salmonella. That is a problem that has damaged severely California and Arizona in the last years, as I think you know. And I've been in California, I think, 4 times during the last year, working in contact with the growers and growers associations, like Western Growers, for example. And I received a very positive feedback from the growers saying, yes, we do need such a solution in order to be able to test before we deliver due to the problems we had. On the other hand, I must admit, just a few meetings I had with potential investors, or let's say with VC, I received different feedback saying, oh, we have seen so many, since it's a hot field, we have seen so many promising technologies and solutions during the last years that eventually haven't delivered the promises, that we are very skeptical now. We don't want to touch this area. What do you think, Shirish? Is that the same opinion of the entire investors community?
I think that's a great question. So for better or worse, VCs tend to be pattern matchers. Right? They're pattern matchers to a fault sometimes, where they have seen a bunch of companies not working out or the technology not delivering. They think everybody's like that. So I think the investors that you want to talk to are the ones who will dig in deeper into what you're presenting and maybe have the right background, and then perhaps you'll have a better outcome. However, maybe the pharma VCs, not the technology VCs, but the VCs in a different sector. The biotech VCs, they'll have a more nuanced point of view. but there's other issues. For example, you ought to think about California, as I think Adam pointed out. The regulatory environment in California is quite strict. So anything you bring forward, you want to make sure will not run into the problems of regulation where something is not allowed. You know, California is particularly good or bad, depending on your point of view about that, but it is difficult. So if you can solve that problem, and then you can show an actual need for what you're doing, and if it solves a real problem, then you have to convince an investor that you have the distribution and the manufacturing capabilities that you can get it in the hands of the end customer on a cost-effective basis where you have proper margins and so on. So I think if you can show that you can solve all those problems and get past the regulation, then I think you will have and find a investor group that is open to digging in. And I think the biotech pharma investors are probably better than the technology investors, the people who invest in AI and stuff like that. They're probably not as good a target for what you're doing. Yeah, so I think it's a question of finding the right investor for the right company, but then also making sure that all the other things that entrepreneurs may or may not think of, regulation, distribution, margins, channels, and all of that are taken care of.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sharon, can I jump in 1 second? Because I think there's something that's important here, which is Jonathan, one of the things I think that often a lot of companies also don't realize is who are the investors that they're speaking to? Because I think Shirish saw this as well when we were doing clean tech 10 or 15 years ago, where a lot of generalist investors get excited about an area and sometimes come in and don't know it and don't have the right thought process around the time horizon stuff's going to take to monetize. The reality is your product might be adequate, but might not be adequate for someone who's at a venture firm which has a 5 to 7 year time horizon, where comparatively someone who's at a family office might be looking at this from a much more decade or generational perspective. And it's one of the things I like to say to people looking at ag tech or entrepreneurs that I think is really important is just because you're using AI, machine learning, or have a SaaS business model, it doesn't mean that your time to get product to market and adoption is going to be as quick as it's going to be in another industry. The fundamental thing, and I know Ofir understands this and so does Shirish, is you're still in the ag sector. So you could have AI machine learning, but that doesn't mean that your customer or the farmer is going to adopt it as quickly as, say, adoption is going to be in other tech areas or other parts of the economy. And I really think you have to understand how long, and you have to be honest. You have to be honest with yourself as to how long it's really going to take for adoption. And then once you know that, you might have to look for a different type of an investor who thinks long-term rather than a 5 to 7 year time horizon. Because one of the big issues a lot of companies have is they've got great technology. And as you said, your customer wants it, but is your customer really ready for it? Or as Shirish said, is the regulatory environment ready for it? Because if it's not, it's going to take you longer. And someone who's a VC just might not be the right investor for you because you're not going to be able to commercialize and scale your technology in the time horizon they would expect.
Yeah, I think
that's also, there is a comment here from Peter. Peter, do you want to comment on that? Which is very relevant to what you just said. Can you introduce yourself first?
Certainly. So I'm Peter Hers, general partner with First Course Capital. And I wanted to just raise a question and see what other investors thought about this topic. Adam's discussion of plenty and the importance of actual flavor, I think is really interesting. And, connecting it to the next step, our taste buds are actually evolved to seek out the nutrition our bodies need. So if you look at things that are not hijacked by processing, the more flavor that food has, the more it is nutrient dense with what we need to live. So that's an important angle to something like Plenty. But my question was really around the idea that technology, agtech, and engineering as applied to agriculture and food seems to me to have two different types that are, one of which I think is interesting. For example, robotics, things that automate what might have been done by hand, I think is interesting. Things that are like traceability and transparency, so you know where the food comes from. These are all things that tech can do well. But I think the record of technology trying to solve for a biological problem seems to be really problematic. And it seems like the tools of engineering are not suited for trying underlying biological systems. And I'd be interested in what other investors on this call think about that distinction.
So Peter, maybe I can answer part of your question. So I think the point about these technologies take a long time to scale compared to the IT technologies is a very good one, and especially where it's not in the robotics and the automation and so forth, as you mentioned. So it takes a long time to develop, long time to scale, and venture funds by their very nature have a lifespan of 10 years. Right, and investable period is 3 to 4 years, and then there's another 6 to 7 years lifespan. Now, we can get an extension by about 2 years typically, so 12 years. So if a technology cannot be brought to market and scale in a reasonable amount of time, in that much amount of time, then we get into it sometimes, as we did with solar and a bunch of other areas, but then we run into problems. On the other hand, to Jonathan's point, I think there are some, in addition to family offices, as Adam mentioned, there are companies, there are funds that are evergreen funds that they don't have, they don't have 10, 12-year life cycles, and you can find those, and they're not easy to find, but it's possible to find those, and they will have a different cycle. Regarding robotics and so forth, I agree that that's a place where not only can Silicon Valley and California innovate, but the need is great. For example, we invested many years ago in a company called Blue River Technology. Blue River Technology, I was initially on the board, and then one of my partners got on the board. And that technology what it did was it basically used computer vision and robotics to thin lettuce. And the 80% of the United States lettuce production is in Salinas, which is just a few miles down south. So this company was successful. They used to hang a robot in the back of a tractor and drive it around, thinning lettuce very efficiently. Company was acquired by John Deere, and we made a very good return. But there are some other agtech companies that I think have not been mentioned so far. I'll name one, where it's not so much about agtech. It is applied to farming and agriculture, but it is about other things. I'll give you an example of a very successful investment we made when I was at Khosla Ventures, and the company was Climate Corporation. Climate Corporation was selling weather insurance to farmers. Essentially, farmers all across the world really are at the mercy of the weather, right? And they don't know whether from year to year whether their income is going to go up or down. So by offsetting that risk, that was a huge aspirin, right? That a huge headache that needed an aspirin. And a small company, which was Climate Corp, was able to do it because in California, because we were able to hire high quality AI and data scientists and analysts to assess the risk. But then a small company cannot carry the risk. And so these guys were smart enough to then offset the risk with another reinsurance company so that they were not carrying a whole bunch of risk. And the company was wildly successful and was acquired by Monsanto for over $1 billion. So nobody went to the field, right? It was all about financial engineering, if you will. And so there are a couple of examples here that work. But the point about coming up with a biological compound that then is successful is tough to do it in 5 to 7 years.
Listen, I don't know if any of you noticed, but it is 10 a.m. here in California, and it seems that we just reached the tip of the iceberg. There is so much to talk about. I have long list of questions. I see my Q&A box where people wants to send, you know, their deck to you, Shirish and Adam, and maybe some others. And we didn't even ask and congratulate Ofir about the latest round that they closed and heard about his experience. I wish we had another, 30 minutes to keep that discussion going. I think people just warm up now with all these questions. What shall we do? I really want to thank all of you for coming here today. For those of you, if it's in the morning, the dark morning of California, or if you are in other parts of the world, if there is anyone here who would like to share their company deck or one pager, I request that you send it to info@ci-cc.org, and we will forward it to the investors that we have. If you have more questions to the panel, please feel free to send them to the same email address that I just shared with you, info@ci-cc.org, and we will try to answer them later on. As I said, this discussion was recorded and it will be available on the CICC YouTube channel. If you want to watch it again and get some insights. Some people asked me to share the slide that Adam showed earlier. Adam, with your permission, I can send it to the people who were on this call. And you know what? We'll have to do it again sometime soon. So please follow us on social media, our LinkedIn or Facebook page, and just follow up and see when will be the next discussion. This is part of a series of activities that we hold on Agtech. This is actually the second meeting. We have some more coming, down our sleeves. So just follow us up, and I hope to see all of you very soon again. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Ofir. Thank you, Shirish. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. And I wish you, a good rest of the day.
And by the way,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Please send me any decks that you have that for me, and I'm always willing to listen to them and hear them. And if you want to ever know what kind of an investor I am, you can ask Ron Hadar, who's on this call, who I've invested in them, and we went through some pretty interesting times. So
Thank you.
with that shameless plug, I will stop talking now. Thank you very much.
We didn't even hear your experience with Israelis and what you want from Israeli investors, but you know what? We have to call for another meeting and do it one more time.
Bye,
All right.
everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Sharon, can you hold for a second?
Yes.
Sharon.